So if you open up an official World Bank spreadsheet, you are going to see St. Martin listed right there as a high-income economy.
Right. Sitting right next to the heavy hitters.
Yeah, exactly. Like it shares that exact same prestigious column with countries like, Switzerland or Norway or Singapore. And that label, I mean, it projects this aura of just absolute financial security.
It sounds bulletproof.
It really does. But if you put down the spreadsheet and you actually look at the physical reality of this Caribbean territory, specifically the Dutch part of the island we are looking at today, that whole illusion kind of fractures.
It fractures pretty quickly once you dig into the numbers.
Right. Because you find this economy that literally shrank by an astonishing 13.3% in a single year.
Hmm.
And then you look at its national power grid, expecting, the cutting edge infrastructure of a wealthy nation, and you find out that it runs on exactly 0% renewable energy. Zero.
Which is wild for a Caribbean island.
Completely wild. So today, we're doing a deep dive into the data behind this ultimate economic paradox. We have this really comprehensive economic and social research report that basically maps out the anatomy of what we are calling a vulnerable paradise.
Yeah, and that term, vulnerable paradise, is incredibly apt for the data we are about to examine. Our mission for this deep dive is to essentially deconstruct how a microeconomy actually functions when it puts every single asset it has into one, highly lucrative but phenomenally fragile basket.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to start with the physical limitations.
Yeah, you really have to start there. We are looking at a society that is optimized for maximum short-term revenue at the expense of almost all structural resilience.
And looking at the raw geographic data from the report, the scale of this place fundamentally dictates its economic destiny, right? The total land area of St. Martin is exactly 34 square kilometers.
Which is tiny. To give you a mental model for that, 34 square kilometers is roughly half the size of the island of Manhattan.
Half of Manhattan, wow.
Yeah, half. So every economic constraint, every infrastructural bottleneck, every demographic pressure we are going to discuss today is amplified by this extreme lack of physical space. I mean, you don't have a hinterland to retreat to.
Right.
You don't have vast internal resources to exploit. You are confined to that very specific footprint.
And the land they do have is, well, it's highly compromised. The report states that 19.2% of that already tiny territory sits at an elevation of less than 5 meters above sea level.
So almost a fifth of the island is basically at eye level with the ocean.
Exactly. But here is the statistic that I just really struggled to reconcile when I was reading this. 100% of their urban population lives in these coastal, disaster-prone zones.
Yeah, the entirety of the urban footprint is right there in the danger zone.
Which is crazy. Like, if you know the water is rising and the storms in the region are intensifying, why wouldn't you build your primary urban centers on, higher, safer ground inland?
Well, because the geography is entirely subservient to the economic model.
What do you mean by that?
The engine of St. Martin is high-end international tourism and maritime logistics. I mean, you cannot build a deep water port for a Royal Caribbean cruise ship up in the hills.
Oh, right, of course.
And you cannot sell a luxury premium-priced resort experience without immediate frictionless access to those white sand beaches. The economy essentially demands proximity to the water.
So the resorts have to be on the beach.
Exactly. Therefore, the infrastructure, the workforce housing, the utilities, it all must cluster around the coast.
Yeah.
The very geography that generates their wealth is simultaneously their greatest existential threat.
So the economy dictates that the entire population basically stands on the front line of climate change.
That is a reality, yeah.
And when you look at their GDP data in the report, you can actually see the financial trauma of that geographic vulnerability. It doesn't look like a normal economic cycle.
No, it looks like a heart rate monitor jumping all over the place.
Yeah, it looks like the readout of a seismograph during an earthquake. So in 2013, the territory posted a relatively healthy growth rate of 4.6%.
Which feels total consistent with that high income label we talked about.
Right, it seems fine. But then observe what happens when physical reality intersects with that economic model.
2017.
Yes, 2017, Hurricane Irma strikes the island. This was just a catastrophic external physical shock. And the GDP violently contracted by 7.5% in response.
Which is massive for a national economy.
Yeah.
Because the resorts were physically dismantled by the wind, right? The airport was severely damaged.
Everything just stopped.
Yeah, the primary mechanism for generating revenue, which is welcoming tourists, was physically halted.
And then they barely have time to clear the debris and rebuild the hotels before 2020 arrives. The global pandemic hits, global travel freezes, and the GDP doesn't just contract, it literally falls off a cliff.
A 13.3% drop in a single year.
A 13.3% drop. I mean, it sounds like a glass jaw heavyweight boxer.
That is a great way to put it.
Right. Like, they look incredibly strong on paper. They have this high-income, rich tourists walking around. But one solid punch from a hurricane or a pandemic, and they are just out cold on the mat.
Exactly. Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, if you look at the immediate aftermath in 2021, the data does show a 13.9% compensatory growth rate as travel restrictions eased.
So they bounce back.
They bounced back, but we have to be really careful not to view that bounce as a return to genuine stability.
Why not? The numbers went back up.
Because if you draw a trend line through all the macroeconomic data in the report from 1960 to 2022, the overall growth trajectory is shifting downward.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the peaks of their recoveries are requiring much more effort, while the depths of their crashes are becoming significantly more severe over time. For you listening to this, it's worth considering your own career or business. How much of your perceived stability or high income is actually built on a fragile foundation that's completely exposed to external shocks?
That is a really sobering thought, which kind of forces us to look at the structural mechanics of why they crash so hard.
Right, because plenty of nations experience hurricanes or global recessions.
Exactly. But they don't see 13% of their entire economy vaporize in 12 months. So if we look at the industrial breakdown in this report, it really reveals a masterclass in the dangers of monoculture.
It's extreme monoculture.
Let's look at domestic production, starting with agriculture. In 2020, agriculture added a total of about $1.11 million to the GDP.
1.11 million. I mean, on a macroeconomic scale, that means agriculture essentially does not exist.
Nothing.
Right? There's no domestic food production capable of sustaining the population.
And manufacturing is effectively in the exact same boat. It represents a mere 1.17% of the GDP.
And it's shrinking too.
Yeah, in 2020, manufacturing experienced a negative 13.1% growth rate. So they're not growing their own food, and they are not producing their own physical goods.
What remains is just a massive monolithic service sector. Services make up well over 70% of the entire economy.
Over 70%. And within that sector, international tourism is just the absolute, undisputed ruler.
It is the whole game.
At its peak, the report shows that international tourism receipts accounted for 75.1% of all of St. Martin's exports.
Which is staggering. That means 3/4 of the money flowing into this country from the outside world is purely generated by people physically showing up to visit.
Just getting off a plane or a boat. And in 2019, they processed roughly 2.5 million visitors through that tiny 34 square kilometer space.
Think about that density for a second.
It's crazy. But then when 2020 hit, that number dropped to 1.64 million, and tourism's share of total exports was just slashed to 46.1%.
And this really illustrates the concept of economic sovereignty, or rather, the complete lack thereof.
Yeah, explain that, because that's a key concept here.
Well, when you produce nothing physical, you exist in a permanent state of external dependency. You are forced to import absolutely everything required to sustain both your local population and the millions of tourists you host.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's quantify that dependency. The report shows that in 2022, goods imports remained astronomically high at roughly $1.15 billion.
Over $1 billion in imports for half the size of Manhattan.
Right. And because they are exporting very little in terms of physical goods, that created a staggering trade deficit of negative $927 million.
Yearly, $1 billion black hole.
And the origin of those imports is crucial, too. The data says 95.6% of these imported goods come from other high-income economies.
Yeah, and that specific metric, importing 95.6% from high-income nations, tells us how this economy functions mechanically.
Because it means it's expensive, right?
Exactly. They are not importing raw, inexpensive materials from developing nations to refine and add value to domestically. They are importing highly processed, finished, premium-priced goods from wealthy nations.
Okay, wait, hold on. Let me make sure I understand the flow of capital here.
Sure.
They are buying premium, expensive goods from rich countries, importing them at a massive trade deficit, only to turn around and serve those exact same goods to tourists who are arriving from those very same rich countries.
Yes. They are functioning purely as a geographic middleman.
It operates like it's like a luxury restaurant where the management doesn't own the building, they don't grow any of the ingredients, they don't even manufacture the plates they serve the food on.
That's a perfect analogy.
They simply unlock the doors and hope a wealthy clientele decides to walk in and pay a premium for the ambiance. And if a hurricane closes the road to the restaurant or a pandemic keeps everyone at home, the revenue goes to zero, but the cost of importing all those ingredients remains.
Yep. And operating that restaurant requires a tremendous amount of energy.
Oh, the energy data.
Yeah. Because the resorts need constant air conditioning, the deep water ports require massive logistical power, the desalination plants need energy to produce fresh water for everybody.
Right.
Which leads us to the energy data in the report. And this is where the contradictions become particularly sharp.
I am honestly still trying to process the energy statistics. I mean, we are talking about a sun-drenched Caribbean island.
Endless.
Endless. But the report confirms that 100% of St. Martin's electricity is generated by fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal. 100%.
The percentage of renewable energy contributing to their power output is exactly 0.0%. How is it possible that a sun-drenched island hasn't put up a single solar panel for the grid? It's like dying of thirst while sailing on a freshwater lake.
It is a profound mathematical inefficiency. What's fascinating here is, particularly when you analyze their energy intensity, the data indicates their energy intensity is 7.12 megajoules per 2021 PPP dollar of GDP.
Wait, before we dive into the implications of that 7.12 number, let's just clarify that metric for the listener. PPP stands for Purchasing Power Parity, right?
Correct. So purchasing power parity is an economic metric that compares different countries' currencies through a kind of basket of goods approach.
Right, so it adjusts for local costs.
Exactly. It adjusts for the fact that a dollar buys you a different amount of actual stuff in New York than it does in St. Martin. So when the report says they use 7.12 megajoules to generate a single PPP dollar of GDP, it is a standardized way of measuring how much physical energy they have to burn to create 1 unit of real economic value.
And is 7.12 high? It's quite high. It demonstrates that their current setup is deeply, deeply inefficient.
But let's be fair to St. Martin for a second regarding the 0.0% renewables. Because my first instinct is to ask, well, why haven't they blanketed the island in solar panels?
Right. It seems like the obvious fix.
But we just established they only have 34 square kilometers of land, and I've seen pictures. The interior is really rocky and hilly. Building a utility-scale solar farm requires vast amounts of flat, open real estate, which they simply do not have.
That's very true.
So isn't relying on imported high-density diesel actually the most logical space-saving choice for a micro-island, even if it's dirty?
Space is absolutely a primary constraint. You are right about that. But it does not fully explain the total absence of renewables.
Because they could put them on roofs.
Exactly. You can utilize rooftop solar. You can integrate solar into commercial resort structures. The barrier is much more systemic than just land area. It's an economic phenomenon known as the lock-in effect.
Lock-in effect. How does that work in this context?
Well, transitioning a national grid from diesel generators to decentralized solar requires immense upfront capital expenditure.
You need the cash to buy the panels.
You have to purchase the panels, yes, but you also have to install high-capacity battery storage to handle the intermittent nature of sunlight, and you basically have to fundamentally rewire the grid infrastructure.
Right. The sun goes down, you still need the AC running in the hotel.
Precisely. Now, if a microeconomy is trapped in a cycle of short-term survival, meaning their capital is constantly being depleted to either repair the damage from the last hurricane or to pay the exorbitant immediate costs of imported diesel just to keep the resorts running this week, they never accumulate the surplus capital or the administrative bandwidth required to execute a long-term transition.
Oh, wow. So they're literally too busy bailing water out of the boat to stop and install a better engine?
That is exactly it. It's an expensive trap, and the logistics of diesel dependency just compound the vulnerability. I mean, they do not refine oil.
No, of course not.
The fuel arrives on specialized tanker ships. It must be pumped into local storage facilities and then distributed. Any fluctuation in global crude oil prices or any disruption in maritime shipping routes immediately spikes the operating costs of every hotel, every restaurant, and every single desalination plant on the island.
So they have outsourced their energy security entirely.
Entirely. They pay a premium just to keep the lights on.
But energy isn't the only thing they have to import to keep this massive machine running. Because when we look at who is actually plugging in those diesel generators, making the beds in the luxury resorts and processing the tourists at the airport, The demographic data paints a picture of a society that is undergoing a radical transformation.
Yeah, if you want to forecast the structural viability of St. Martin over the next 20 years, the demographic section of this report is probably the most critical part.
It's fascinating.
We're observing the rapid formation of an aging safe haven, but one that is built on a highly precarious foundation.
So what does this all mean? Let's trace the fertility rate, because the drop here is staggering. In 1960, the total fertility rate was 4.77.
Almost 5 kids per woman.
Right. That is a robust society with large families, built-in generational support networks, and a naturally replenishing workforce. But by 2022, that number had collapsed to 1.44.
Which is far below the replacement rate of 2.1.
Far below. Consequently, the crude birth rate plummeted from 28.2 per 1,000 people down to just 9.1.
It is a really accelerated demographic transition.
Yeah.
And it is occurring simultaneously with what we can call a health dividend.
Meaning people are living longer.
Yes. Because the island maintains that high-income status, it has been able to provide a baseline standard of living that significantly boosts longevity, even with scarce medical resources on the island itself.
Right. The data says life expectancy jumped from 66.3 years in 1960 to 76.3 years today, a full decade longer.
And in fact, the data notes that females now have a 92.2% probability of living to age 65.
Which, I mean, on an individual human level, that is a massive success story. People are living much longer, healthier lives. But structurally, when you pair a 76-year life expectancy with a collapsed birth rate of 1.44, the proportion of the population over the age of 65 just surges.
It creates a top-heavy demographic pyramid.
Yeah, the data shows it went from 4.3% to 13.9% of the total population being over 65.
Which creates a massive void in the labor market.
Right. Who is doing the work?
Exactly. The native population is aging out of the workforce, and they are not producing enough children to replace themselves in the labor pool. Yet the economy is still 70% reliant on labor-intensive service jobs.
You can't run a resort without maids and cooks and front desk staff.
Who works in the restaurants?
Yes.
Who staffs the deep water ports?
Well, the answer, according to the report, is an unprecedented reliance on immigration. The report reveals that nearly 70% of the total population in St. Martin are immigrants.
Let that sink in. 7 out of 10 people.
Specifically 69.5%. In 2020, that equated to over 30,148 people. And the trend is ongoing. Even in 2023, net migration was positive 550.
And this is the mechanism by which the economy survives. It is an entirely outsourced society. Immigrant labor is the core engine that allows the service sector to function despite the demographic collapse of the native population.
But if 7 out of 10 people you pass on the street are immigrants, this isn't just an economy reliant on foreign tourists, it's an economy reliant on foreign labor to serve those tourists.
Right.
It's essentially an outsourced society, like you said. But how does a society function mechanically under those conditions? Let's think about the social contract here.
This is where it gets really delicate.
If the native population is aging, they're going to require pensions, they're going to need specialized geriatric health care, and expanded social support systems, right?
Of course.
Historically, a country pays for those systems by taxing a large base of young native workers. But here, the tax base is entirely dependent on transient, imported labor.
And that exposes the fatal flaw in the whole system.
What happens when there's a shock?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The social safety net assumes continuous, uninterrupted economic growth to keep the immigrant workforce employed and paying taxes. If the primary industry takes a hit, say a pandemic halts global travel, the resorts close.
Right.
The immigrant labor force, facing sudden unemployment and extremely high local living costs, well, they might be forced to leave. Or at the very least, they stop contributing to the tax base.
Because they don't have incomes to tax.
Right. So the revenue collapses exactly at the moment the aging native population becomes most reliant on state support.
It's an incredibly brittle arrangement, which forces us to ask how the government actually manages its finances under this kind of pressure. If the tax base is that fragile and the economy is subject to 13% contractions overnight, how do they afford to maintain the infrastructure of a high-income nation?
Well, they shift the burden. And the data regarding education provides a really fascinating look into their coping mechanisms for this.
Yeah, the education stats were wild. Education is typically viewed as the core responsibility of a sovereign state, right?
Yeah. Yes. And the report notes that primary school completion in St. Martin remains statistically very high, at about 112%.
Just to clarify the math on that for the listener, because 112% sounds impossible, a completion rate over 100% usually means they are including older students who are completing primary education outside the traditional age bracket, correct?
Yes, exactly. It indicates an accumulation of older students moving through the system, often due to grade repetition or delayed starts. But the real structural revelation occurs at the secondary education level.
Okay, lay it on me.
The data shows that an overwhelming 92.7% of secondary school students are enrolled in private schools.
That statistic is just, it's wild. 92.7% essentially means the public secondary education system is practically non-existent for the vast majority of the population.
It is entirely dominated by the private sector.
Now, the report also states that education accounts for roughly 23% of total government spending. If the government is spending almost a quarter of its budget on education, why are 92 out of 100 kids in private secondary schools?
Because maintaining universal, high-quality public secondary infrastructure is exceptionally expensive and administratively demanding.
So the government just kind of gave up.
In a way, yes. By heavily relying on private institutions to provide this service, the government is effectively offloading a massive structural burden directly onto the citizens.
Wow.
It is a form of shadow privatization. The state simply cannot absorb the full cost of educating the workforce while simultaneously managing the fallout from hurricanes and volatile tourism cycles.
But the societal risk there is immense. If you gatekeep secondary education behind private tuition in an economy that is already entirely dependent on volatile service jobs, you are mathematically guaranteeing long-term social stratification.
It builds severe inequality right into the foundation of the society.
The families who can afford the tuition, they maintain their status, and the families who are disrupted by the next hurricane, they fall permanently behind because they can't afford the private school.
And we must emphasize how deeply those disruptions cut. The report details what economists call a scar effect.
A scar effect, meaning the damage doesn't heal.
Right. The external shocks of 2017 and 2020 did not just pause economic growth, they inflicted structural trauma on the financial system itself. They left scars. Look at the current account deficit in 2020.
Oh, I have that here. It spiked to 23.5% of their GDP.
Now, a current account deficit of that magnitude indicates massive capital flight.
Meaning the money is leaving the island.
Exactly. When an extreme shock hits, investors, both domestic business owners on the island and foreign entities, they assess the geographic and structural vulnerability of Sint Maarten, and they rapidly move their capital to safer, more diversified jurisdictions. The money physically leaves the ecosystem.
It's like everyone running for the exits at the same time.
Precisely.
So wait, if the domestic capital is fleeing the island, the tourism revenue has dropped by half, the trade deficit is nearly $1 billion, and the government is already so broke it's outsourcing public education to the private sector? How did Sint Maarten not completely default and collapse into systemic ruin in 2020? I mean, how did the lights stay on?
This raises an important question, and the answer lies in a financial lifeline that really complicates their status as an independent, high-income economy.
Okay.
The report details the volume of official development assistance, or ODA, that flowed into the territory.
Basically foreign aid.
Yes. In 2020, Sint Maarten received $4,099 per capita in foreign aid.
Over $4,000 for every single person on the island.
By 2021, the total net ODA reached $129 million.
And the source of that capital is the crucial variable here. The data explicitly points to the Netherlands as the absolute core donor.
The absolute core.
They provided over $125 million in bilateral aid.
Right, because Sint Maarten operates as a constituent country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
They have a colonial past, and this is the modern remnant of that.
Exactly. When their internal economic engine seizes up, they rely on direct fiscal transfers from the European mainland to prevent total systemic failure.
So it's a trust fund economy.
That's one way to look at it.
They have the outward title of a high-income nation, but the moment the car breaks down, they have to call their parent country, the Netherlands, to pay the mechanic.
It breaks down the paradox of sovereignty. High income is sustained only by that financial umbilical cord to the mainland. It totally masks the true fragility of the island's domestic revenue capabilities.
This forces a serious reevaluation of that label we talked about at the very beginning. If you look at the raw GDP per capita, sure, it looks high, but their structural sovereignty is entirely dependent on a wealthy parent country absorbing the catastrophic risks.
Yes.
If you severed that financial lifeline to the Netherlands tomorrow, The physical realities of a 34 square kilometer island with no agriculture, no manufacturing, and 0% renewable energy would instantly reassert themselves.
It's the ultimate hidden subsidy of the microstate model. The high-income status is effectively underwritten by external European capital.
Wow. Okay, so we have spent a long time dissecting a very, very grim reality.
It is a bit heavy, yes.
A tiny coastal population, heavily reliant on an aging native demographic and a massive imported labor force, burning imported fossil fuels to sell imported luxury goods to tourists, all while relying on the Netherlands to bail them out every time a storm hits.
It sounds bleak when you list it all out like that.
It feels like an unsolvable mathematical trap. But the final section of this report actually pivots significantly. It outlines an escape route.
Yes, it does.
And crucially, it doesn't involve trying to physically expand the island or reclaim land from the sea, which they can't do anyway.
Right. The solution they are pursuing relies on transcending their physical geography entirely. They're trying to do this through digitalization.
Okay, so going digital.
If your primary vulnerability is that your economic physical assets exist in a hurricane zone, the logical countermeasure is to build assets that exist in the cloud.
And the data actually demonstrates real momentum here, which is the most optimistic part of this report. If you track the number of secure internet servers per million people on the island, in 2010, the number was 0.
Completely zero.
But by 2020, it had skyrocketed exponentially to 12,222 secure servers per million people.
That is a very deliberate structural pivot. And we can compare this digital growth directly against their physical logistics to see the contrast.
Let's do that.
The report notes that container port throughput, meaning the physical shipping of goods, has remained pretty much completely flat at approximately 105,000 TEUs.
Okay, let's quickly define TEU for the listener so we can grasp the scale of that. A TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit.
Right, it's an industry standard.
It's basically equal to one standard 20-foot long metal shipping container you see on the back of a semi-truck on the highway. So their physical shipping of these containers is totally stagnant.
Precisely. They're not moving more physical boxes than they were a decade ago. However, the report shows that computer and communication services now constitute 10.1% of their total service exports.
Wow, over 10%.
Yes, they are successfully beginning to export data and digital infrastructure, using it to bypass their physical borders.
I am genuinely fascinated by this strategy. I mean, an internet server does not care if the cruise ships stop running because of a pandemic.
Not at all.
The internet doesn't have a hurricane season. If they can distribute their cloud architecture properly, they can generate export revenue that is completely immune to their geographic vulnerabilities.
It is definitely the most viable path forward. But, and there is a big but, we must immediately connect this digital ambition back to the physical constraints we discussed earlier.
Oh, right. Power.
Exactly. You cannot become a regional hub for secure data servers if your national power grid is unstable. Data centers consume immense, continuous amounts of electricity.
And right now, that electricity is 100% fossil fuels.
Right. So if your entire grid is powered by imported diesel, your digital economy is still fundamentally tethered to the volatility of global oil markets and maritime supply chains.
Ah, I see. You can build a server in the cloud, but the server still has to be plugged into the ground.
Beautifully said.
If the diesel ship is delayed, the cloud goes dark.
Which is why the report concludes with a clear four-step blueprint for transitioning St. Martin into what they call a sustainable powerhouse.
And these steps, they can't be executed in isolation, right? They are highly interdependent.
They are completely linked. You can't do one without the others.
Okay, let's walk through the mechanics of this blueprint. Step 1 is energy diversification. They have to break the lock-in effect of that 0.0% renewable energy statistic.
It's step 1 for a reason.
If they can deploy commercial solar on roofs or build microgrids or figure out regional wind solutions, they decouple their baseline operating costs from imported fossil fuels. The capital they currently bleed out to oil companies stays on the island.
Exactly. And then step 2 builds directly upon that stabilized energy foundation. They call it de-single tracking the economy.
Right, ending the monoculture.
Yes. They must aggressively scale that nascent digital service sector to dilute the 75% reliance on tourism. If computer and communication services can grow from 10% of exports to, say, 30 or 40%, then a future collapse in global travel will cause a recession, sure, but it will not cause a 13.3% total systemic vaporizing of the GDP.
It creates a buffer. Okay, so step 3 addresses the people side. Social Security reform.
Which is urgent.
Because you cannot run a high-income nation with a 1.44 fertility rate without fundamentally restructuring how you care for the elderly. They have to build pension and healthcare systems that do not rely on the incredibly precarious assumption that 30,000 immigrant workers will always be present and fully employed to fund the tax base.
They need a self-sustaining social net. And the final step, step 4, forces them right back to the reality of the map. Climate resilience.
Because the ocean is still right there.
Regardless of how successfully they digitize their exports, 100% of their urban population remains on the coast. They must secure the capital to harden that 19.2% of low-lying land.
And hardening isn't just an engineering buzzword. It means physically engineering survival.
It's expensive, physical labor.
It means pouring concrete for seawalls, elevating critical roadways above floodplains, and decentralizing water treatment facilities so a single storm surge doesn't contaminate the entire freshwater supply. It is an incredibly capital-intensive requirement.
It is. And for you listening, this 4-step blueprint, diversifying energy, decoupling revenue from a single volatile source, preparing for demographic shifts, and physically hardening your assets. It is not just macroeconomic theory for a Caribbean island.
No, it applies everywhere.
It is a highly relevant framework for analyzing the resilience of your own local economy, or your industry, or even your personal career. Are you relying on 0% renewable energy in your own life? Are you single-tracked in your skill set?
That is a great takeaway. To synthesize what we've explored today, the World Bank spreadsheet doesn't lie, but it certainly doesn't tell the whole truth.
Data without context is just numbers.
Right. St. Martin operates a high-income, high-standard-of-living economy. But that economy requires burning imported fossil fuels to sell imported luxury goods, utilizing a heavily imported labor force, all while relying on the Netherlands to underwrite the catastrophic risks of living on 34 square kilometers of hurricane-prone coastline.
It is the ultimate fragile paradox.
Yet, in the exponential growth of their digital servers, we see a viable blueprint for evolution.
The transition from a vulnerable paradise to a resilient system is entirely dependent on whether they can escape the gravity of those short-term survival cycles.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a conceptual question to mull over, because the data we've analyzed today fundamentally challenges our traditional definition.
It really does.
If a territory's native population is shrinking, if nearly 70% of its residents are transient immigrant workers, if its primary revenue requires foreigners to briefly visit, if its financial survival is guaranteed by a European government thousands of miles away, and its most viable strategy for future growth is hosting decentralized digital servers in the cloud, what actually defines a country in the 21st century?
It's a profound question. Is St. Martin a traditional nation-state in the way we usually understand sovereignty and borders? Or are we examining the early prototype of a highly globalized corporate pop-up state?
It forces us to reconsider whether sovereignty is defined by physical land or by the digital and economic systems a population controls.
It's a completely different way to look at the map.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take a hard look at the structural foundations of your own local economy, question the labels on the spreadsheet, and we will see you next time.